let's go to the fifth lesson, and we'll pick that one up tomorrow. Look at Revelation 1:11-20. It says, saying with a loud voice, and I already read verse 11, and I turned to see the voice, verse 12, that spoke to me, and having turned, I saw. Now look at what I wrote in my journal. This is the only picture of Jesus in the whole Bible. Have you ever thought about that? A little bit we learn in Isaiah 53, where it says that his visage, his face, was marred more than any man. But we don't really have we don't know if Jesus was tall or short. We don't know if he's wide or narrow. We don't know anything about him physically, other than his lineage and everything. Now, we can read in verses 11-20 the only word picture describing God the Son, Jesus Christ, in 7 elements. Look what we get. His hair, his eyes, his feet, his voice, his hands, his mouth, and back to his face. And all of these elements. Why 7? Because it's a complete picture of the risen Christ. Now, I want you to think about that. And we're going to go through all the elements. But I want you to first back up and think about why, number 5, why did John get a picture of Jesus? Remember, John is on the island of Patmos, and John knew Jesus. He was one of the original disciples. He was the one closest to Jesus. Remember? The one Jesus loved. Why did Jesus include this visible showing John himself again so John could describe him for everyone? Why? Well, I believe that Jesus was reminding John and us that the Christ of the Gospels is now unleashed. Now think about what I mean. When Jesus walked out of the tomb on resurrection morning, I mean we just celebrated that. Think about what went through their mind when they saw the risen Christ. All of a sudden, they started thinking about 3 years with Jesus. Wherever Jesus went in the Gospels for 3 years, his very presence would make death flee, would make diseases fade, and despair would melt. Broken bodies that came into contact with Jesus were mended. Now, see, all this John saw in person. And what Jesus was reminding him is that everything you saw me do back then, guess what? I'm the same. What does Hebrews 13:5 say? Jesus is the same what? Yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus is the same. And so he could repair a ruined life. He could repair sightless eyes. He restored them. He could fill empty ears with sound. He could take missing fingers and return them if the leper had lost their fingers. He could feed hungering lives until they were satisfied. Basically this, everywhere Jesus went, wherever he was, and whenever he was there, his very presence meant that death and disease and despair were no more. But think about the implications. Jesus only did that from being in one place at a time. When you read the Gospels, it's the most amazing thing to read, that people would be over there and they'd hear Jesus was over there and they would sail across the lake to find him over there. And they'd go over there and find out he was up there in that corner. So they'd run around the Sea of Galilee to get to him. They were always trying to be where he was. Why? Because if you could reach through the crowd and grab his tassel, like Mark 5 says, and that woman that had suffered for her whole life with this disease was instantly cured. Or if you had your friend who never was able to get anywhere, if you could find Jesus in one place, you could tear through the roofing and lower your friend down in front of Jesus, and Jesus could heal him, but only if you could be where Jesus was. But Jesus did all those things only being in one place at a time. That's why people were always chasing him around. Now think, the Gospels record 89 chapters of Jesus being in only one place at a time. But this is what Jesus is underlining for us in the book of Revelation. after Easter Sunday, after the empty tomb, the unlimited power of Christ now became available everywhere by anyone at any time. Jesus was no longer, what I like to say is, he wasn't localized anymore. He wasn't just bound to be in one spot at a time. And after the resurrection, you find Jesus everywhere. I mean, he's walking down the road with two on the way to Emmaus, and he's walking through the door to the upper room. And then they find him up on Mount Arbel, up and over Galilee. And he's available everywhere. The greatest source of peace and hope and joy imaginable, Jesus offered to John on the Isle of Patmos. Jesus Christ is always near us. He is always guarding us. He's always guiding us. He can always comfort us. And John just needs to be reminded of that. Now, this is what John noticed. Something changed. Jesus now was available to him on Patmos. And he was telling him he's available to those in Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamos and Thyatira. You understand? He's available in all of those places. He was available. The empty tomb on resurrection morning meant something had changed. It was Christ's availability. For 3.5 years, anyone who could find him could have any need met, any fear removed, any oppression lifted, any chain broken, any defilement cleansed away, but only if you could find him. See, that's what changed from the Gospels to now, after the resurrection. But let's just zero in. I've been talking about miracles and everything. Go back to verse 5, and I didn't talk very much about it, but I will now. From Jesus Christ, Revelation 1:5, the faithful witness, the firstborn over the dead, the ruler over the kings of the earth, to him who loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood. Jesus is the one who offers the greatest miracle. Now, I know it's late and you haven't had lunch, but I want you to think for a second. There are 37 recorded miracles of Christ. Let's think about them. Jesus cured a leper. Okay, so this leper got fresh new skin like a baby's and couldn't believe it, and everything worked, but in about 30 years or 40 years, the fingers stopped working as well, and after about 50 years, the skin was starting to sag and probably had a little sun damage. How about the one that was deaf? I mean, he could hear everything. The birds, he could hear the wind, he could hear everything, but 10, 20 years of loud noise around him, at work and everything, and the ears started dimming, and by the time he got to the end of his life, his kids were going, "Grandpa, dinner!" Couldn't hear anymore very well. Did you know that's true of every one of Jesus' miracles? He raised people from the dead, they had to die again. He fed people, they were hungry the next day. He gave eyes to people, after a few decades, they dimmed. Not because his miracles were insufficient, just because that's the nature of all of his miracles. All of his miracles diminished with time because of the fall and sin and everything else. But of those recorded amazing miracle after miracle during his time on earth, only one miracle stands out as the greatest, greater than all the rest. Though he healed and fed and calmed the storms and raised the dead, none of them compares to the greatest miracle. Jesus didn't come to impress people. He didn't come to feed the hungry or heal the lepers or manipulate the weather. Jesus came for one purpose, and that was to forgive. That's what all the miracles were about. That's what all the teaching was about. He said, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. We're lost because of our sin, and there's only one cure for that sin, and I'm offering that. That was his greatest miracle, is what I'm trying to tell you. The greatest miracle is still our greatest need. See, that's what's so amazing. There are still sick people, there are still hungry people, there are still people dying. But there are no longer healers and dead raisers, There are no longer gifted miracle workers. God still works miracles, but those have passed away, the sign gifts. But the greatest miracle is still with us. Do you know what that is? That we can point people to the hope of forgiveness. I want to, for just a minute, challenge you with this, because we're supposed to be offering Christ's greatest miracle to our generation. Now, what I was doing, I think we have enough time for this, I was editing one of my books. It's my dissertation, actually, at Dallas Theological Seminary. It's called Living Hope for the End of Days. It's a devotional study of the whole book of Revelation. And I had my Bible and I had my manuscript, and I could hardly get anything done at the church. Because on my lunch hour, when I would sit in the lunchroom, people would stop by and ask me questions. And I couldn't read and I couldn't edit, so I told my secretary, I'm going to go eat lunch at Starbucks downtown where no one can find me so I can read and study for my lunch hour. So every day I went there, every day, same Starbucks. And by the way, it was a bad idea to go to Starbucks at lunch hour because the line would go out the door. They even had the turnstile, you'd go like this and the line went out the door. But I would study in the line, and I would stand in the line. You know how you can work and walk and everything. And every day I'd go to Starbucks, I'd make my order, and when I'd get to the end of the line, I would, the barista would go like this, like you've all experienced, and he'd push it across, and he'd say, "Venti flat white." Hand it to me. Well, I didn't pay much attention. There's gazillions of people and everything. But finally, one day, after I'd been there several days, when he went like this, I looked into his eyes, and his eyes were about the color of our little duckie's beak, orange. Do you know what that means? He had hyperbilirubinemia. His liver was not functioning anymore, and his body was filling up with poisons, and when that happens, the whites of your eyes turn orange. So as my barista with the orange eyes slid my drink across, I looked up at his name tag, Daniel. And I made a deal with the Lord. I said, Lord, in my wallet, I always carry a gospel tract. And what I always do is I take it and I pray over it and say, Lord, help me to have a divine appointment and help me to understand the one you want me to share this with. And I'll be faithful and be an evangelist and share that. And I put it in my wallet. I put it in my pocket and I wait. Well, this guy, I could only reach him at the end of like 30 people. And I have a little rule. I won't witness to someone on company time because it makes the boss angry. It's just very bad to take someone earning $15 an hour and talk to them for 20 minutes about the Lord, Somebody's losing money that's paying them. And so I said, Lord, this Starbucks has like 30 people in line always. If there's ever a time I come in and no one is in line, then I'll witness to him. How do you like that? That was the easy way to get out of feeling bad about witnessing to Daniel. And so I just went back and I was studying in line like normal the next day. There were 30 people, and I just kept studying until I got up to the counter and I said, Venti flat white, 2/3 decaf. And I kept studying, and I went. Now, I don't know if there were angels, scaring everybody off, but for that moment, there was no one behind me at Starbucks at Utica Square. My heart started beating. I thought, wow. And so I just started walking toward the end, and Daniel goes like this and starts sliding it across. And I said, hello, Daniel. And his orange eyes got even wider, that I knew his name. And I said, Daniel, I've been watching you for several weeks now. I come in here every day. And I said, I can see your eyes. I know that you're either on heavy-duty drugs or you're drinking your liver to death. I said, but you are going to die soon and wake up in what the Bible calls eternal destruction, hell. Now, that's about 15 seconds. Now, I was talking to Daniela down here, and I told her that one of my studies I went through every time the Bible presents the gospel. And I found out that I've never found in the Bible anybody that presented the gospel the same way twice. So I thought, I'm going to be sharing it just for Daniel. And so I shared the gospel with him that way, basically handing him a tract across the line as he passed me the Starbucks, and I said, this is a Bible study for you about how not to go to hell. I don't usually share the gospel that way. Well, let me tell you about Daniel. Daniel I had watched for 2 weeks. Daniel was, back then they called him a goth. He wore everything black. Everything he wore was black. He had black everything, but he had piercings. He had piercings everywhere. He had them through his tongue. He had them through his cheeks. His whole ears were pierced with stuff. He wore chains. He had great big metal chains. They looked like big enough for bears. They clinked when he walked. He had big spikes, metal spikes on his shoes, sticking out. I don't know how you don't fall over when they catch each other. He had little stud metal things down his pants on both sides, everything black, even kind of like an M&M black, snow cap on. That was Daniel with orange eyes. So, very noticeable. So I slid across the track to him. His big eyes looked at me. He just said, thanks. And that was it. And so I started praying. I always write down who I witnessed to, and I start praying, and I was going to follow up the next day. And so the next day I prayed, and he was in my journal. Next day I came to Starbucks at Utica Square, waited through 25 people, and I got down to the end, and a young lady pushed my little Starbucks to me. I thought, I looked at my watch. It was the same time he'd always been here. I thought, it was day off. For the next week, every day, no Daniel. So at the end of that week on Friday, when I ordered, I said, hey, where's Daniel? And the cashier looked at me and said, all of us are saying that. She says, did you know 1 week ago today, she said, at about this time, she says, Daniel just walked out the back door of the Starbucks. He's never come back to work. He's never called back. We don't know what happened to him. We're worried about him. I said, well, I am too. And I thought I actually walked around the back of Starbucks to see if he'd collapsed behind the dumpster or something because of his liver, and he wasn't there. And so I finished editing my book. A month went by, and I, didn't come every day anymore. 6 months later, I was working on editing something else, and I was back in my corner, getting my drink, and I was sitting at my little table with my Bible. You know how you sit kind of facing the wall so no one bothers you? And I felt someone coming up, and I could hear clink, clink. I heard metal. I looked down, big black boots, metal. I could see chains, and I went like this, and looking me right in the eye, it was Daniel. He had the biggest smile. His eyes were big, wide, and white. And I looked at him, and I said, Daniel. He says, man, I've been looking for you everywhere. He said, 6 months ago you came and you took that paper and you said you went like that and told me I was going to hell. He said, you actually scared the hell out of me. And he said, you didn't explain it to me. And he said, so I left work. And he said, I took your paper. And he said, I walked down the street of the city. And everybody I met, I said, do you know what this means? Do you know what this means? This man left me and told me I wasn't going to heaven, I was going to hell. Do you know what this means? And he said, finally, I went to a church. They had a big sign that said guts. It was a weightlifter church. He said, and everybody in there looked just like me. I felt so comfortable. And I walked into them and I said, do you know what this means? They said, we do. And he said, we got down on our knees and they led me to Christ. He said, I'm now his specialty was he was a heavy metal, black, heavy metal something drummer. And he said, I'm now the heavy metal drummer for this group that goes out from the church, and they stop everything, put the spotlight on me, and I tell the story of the guy that scared the hell out of me, and I give the gospel. He said, thanks for sharing the gospel. Hey, did you know he was the last person I would have normally have shared the gospel with because I didn't have anything I could relate to him except for one thing. The greatest need everyone has is for forgiveness. And that's the miracle God is still doing if we'll just share the gospel.